At its peak, Aston Martin was the most desirable car brand on earth. Le Mans champion, royal warrant holder, the car Beatles and film stars queued to own. Then the money ran out. The factory gates locked on the workers at Christmas 1974. The entire company sold for £101. In 1982, they built 30 cars for the whole year and couldn't afford the heating. A tractor maker's checkbook, an American rescue in a rainy car park, Ford's millions, a fashion billionaire's faith, 7 bankruptcies, and still the workshop at Newport Pagnell stands. Same tools, same skills, when same ground where coach builders have shaped metal since the 1820s. This is the story of a cyclist and an engineer who built something so beautiful it refused to die. Through a century of financial chaos, 12 ownership changes, and the stubborn inability to make the numbers work that nearly killed it. And that remains, still, the only reason it survives. Chapter 1. The Cyclist and the Hill. The story begins, as so many improbable British stories do, with 2 men who had no business building motorcars, and a hill in Buckinghamshire that gave them a name. Lionel Walker Birch Martin was an old Etonian dandy whose family money came from the China clay mines of Cornwall. Born in 1878, educated at Brasenose College, Oxford, he dressed immaculately, talked incessantly, and moved through Edwardian London with the restless energy of a man who found the world slightly too slow for his appetites. His first obsession wasn't cars. It was cycling. In August 1902, Martin rode from Land's End to London in 22 hours and 16 minutes, smashing the previous record by more than 3 hours. He was, by all accounts, a man who enjoyed proving people wrong at speed. The speed eventually transferred to 4 wheels. And here the story acquires its first flavour of the chaos that would define everything that followed. In the early 1900s, Martin was caught doing 26 miles per hour on Kew Road and banned from driving for 2 years. 26. In an era when the speed limit existed primarily to protect horses, Lionel Martin had managed to get himself exiled from the one pursuit that truly animated him. It was during this enforced exile, pedalling around London between 1910 and 1912, barred from the steering wheel, that he joined the Bath Road Club. And it was at the Bath Road Club that he met Robert Bamford. Bamford was everything Martin was not. A clergyman's son, educated at Sherborne, quiet where Martin was loud, practical where Martin was visionary. He trained as an engineer at Hesse and Savary, a firm producing boat engines and motor cars, and when that company exited the motor trade, Bamford found himself in charge of their London depot at Henniker Mews in Chelsea, a cramped workshop space that smelled of engine oil and possibility. Where Martin had the money and the mouth, Bamford had the hands. He is credited with designing the first Aston Martin prototype, say a machine so bluntly functional that it earned the nickname Coal Scuttle. It looked, by all accounts, exactly like what it was, an engineer's idea of a car, built to work before it was built to please. Bamford and Martin Limited was incorporated on the 15th of January 1913. Initially, they sold and serviced Singer cars from the Henniker Mews premises, which is how most small motor firms started. You sold someone else's product until you could afford to build your own. Martin's ambition was explicit from the start. He wanted, in his own words, a quality car which should be used for racing. Not a quality car that might occasionally race. A racing car, full stop. The gentleman amateur's creed, that competition was the only honest test of a machine, was baked into the company's purpose from its first day of trading. And the name came on the 4th of April, 1914. Martin had entered a modified Singer in the Speed Hill climb at Aston Clinton in Buckinghamshire, a punishing ascent on the Rothschild estate that had hosted 29 events since 1904. He did well. And in the way that so many iconic names arrive through a mixture of happenstance and alphabetical cunning, the first half of Aston Clinton was married to Martin's surname. Martin himself recalled the process with characteristic charm. After reviewing all the flowers, beasts, birds and fishes that we knew, they'd moved on to place names, and since his Singer had recently scored a point or two at the Aston Clinton hill climb, the name was settled. His wife Kate, who would prove rather more important to the company's survival than most histories acknowledge, reportedly appreciated that Aston Martin would place them near the top of any alphabetical listing. It was a small, shrewd observation. The first of many moments where Kate Martin's practical intelligence quietly shaped the company's fate. Then the Great War swallowed everything. Martin joined the Admiralty. Bamford served with the 33rd Field Ambulance Workshop Unit in France. All machinery was sold to Sopwith Aviation to aid the war effort. 4 years of nothing. When the armistice came and they restarted in new premises on Abingdon Road in Kensington, the partnership was already fracturing. Bamford departed in 1920, uncomfortable with Martin's increasingly grandiose plans for expansion. He was replaced on the board by Kate Martin, who became one of the few women directing a British motor company in the early 1920s. The quiet engineer walked away. The promoter and his wife pressed on. What happened next involves one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of motor racing, and one of the most consequential deaths. Count Louis Zborowski was born in London in 1895, the son of a Polish-American father who'd died in a racing crash and an American mother from the Astor dynasty. When his mother died, the 16-year-old Zborowski inherited approximately £11 million in cash, roughly $1.3 billion in today's money, plus Manhattan real estate. He was, by any measure, spectacularly, almost incomprehensibly rich. And he spent his fortune exactly as you might expect a young aristocrat with unlimited means and a dead father's racing legacy to spend it. At his estate, Higham Park in Kent, Zborowski's parties climaxed in the spectacular demolition of purpose-built houses, temporary structures erected solely for the pleasure of watching them collapse. In his stables, he constructed 4 enormous aero-engined racing cars that he called Chitty Bang Bang. A 12-year-old schoolboy named Ian Fleming watched Zborowski race these machines at Brooklands. The memory stayed with Fleming for decades, directly inspiring the children's novel, and, more consequentially for our story, beginning the chain of associations that would one day connect Aston Martin to the most famous fictional spy in the world. Zborowski poured money into Aston Martin from 1920 onwards. He financed racing entries at the 1922 French Grand Prix. He was the company's primary backer, its financial oxygen, the man whose inherited millions kept Martin's ambitions alive. And on the 19th of October, 1924, at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, Count Louis Zborowski was killed. He was 29 years old. He was reportedly wearing the same cufflinks his father had been wearing during his own fatal crash 21 years earlier. Aston Martin entered its first receivership within weeks. Dorothea, Lady Charnwood, purchased the bankrupt company and placed her son on the board. Lionel Martin was forced out. By November 1925, Aston Martin was in receivership again, its second collapse in barely a year. Martin never owned an Aston Martin after 1925. He was knocked from his bicycle at traffic lights on Gloucester Road in October 1945 and died a week later, aged 67. The company he had founded had produced approximately 55 cars in its first 12 years. 55. Not 55,000. 55. A reputation built entirely on racing glory, promotional flair, and the romantic conviction that a beautiful car justified any amount of financial catastrophe. The pattern that would define the next century was already, unmistakably, established. Chapter 2. The Italian from Cardiff. The man who pulled Aston Martin from its second grave was born in Genoa, raised in Cardiff, and possessed of the rare combination of engineering brilliance and physical courage that the early motor trade demanded in equal measure. Augustus Cesare Bertelli arrived in Britain as a child and grew up speaking with a Welsh accent that never entirely left him. By 1908, aged 18, he was already deep in the world of competition. He'd served as riding mechanic to Felice Nazaro at the Targa Bologna, which meant sitting beside a driver at speeds that would terrify most modern motorists, with no seatbelt, no roll cage, and nothing between you and the road surface but faith and reflexes. The war redirected his talents towards aeronautical engineering. When peace came, Bertelli partnered with a wealthy engineer named William Renwick, and together they built a prototype car called the Buzzbox, powered by a 1.5-litre overhead cam engine incorporating Renwick's patented wedge-shaped combustion chamber. The buzzbox was ugly. It was also remarkably quick. When Bertelli and Renwick learned that Aston Martin was dormant, bankrupt, nameless, a brand with no cars and no factory, they saw what Martin himself had seen a decade earlier, an opportunity to marry a proven engine to an established name. By 1926, they'd taken control and relocated the company to Feltham in Middlesex. Their first employee was a young draftsman named Claude Hill. It was an unassuming hire. Hill would prove, over the next 2 decades, to be one of the most important engineers in the company's history, though nobody could have known it at the time, least of all Hill himself. Bertelli's philosophy was simple, and in the context of a company that had nearly died twice in 2 years, extraordinarily bold. He believed cars should be proved through racing, not tested. Proved. And he was one of the vanishingly rare figures in motorsport who designed the cars, built the cars, and then personally drove them in competition. This wasn't delegation. This was a man who staked his engineering reputation on his own willingness to sit behind the wheel at racing speed and discover, in real time, whether the thing he'd built would hold together. His masterpiece was the Ulster. Named after the RAC Tourist Trophy race at the Ards Circuit in Northern Ireland, the Ulster emerged in 1934 from one of those moments of superstition that seem absurd until you learn the result. Bertelli, who believed deeply in omens and luck, had the works cars repainted from British racing green to Italian racing red on his wife's advice before the TT. The cars finished first, second and third in class. Aston Martin won the team prize. As the customer Ulster cost £750, produced 85 brake horsepower, topped 100 miles per hour, and only 30 were ever made. Bertelli later declared it the best car he had ever made. For a man who had designed, built and raced dozens of machines, it was not a casual statement. The racing continued. In 1932, Bertelli himself co-drove with Pat Driscoll to win the Biennial Cup at Le Mans. In 1935, a works car finished third overall and won the Rudge Whitworth Cup. These were extraordinary achievements for a tiny manufacturer running on fumes. But fumes, ultimately, are what they were running on. By 1932, the company needed rescuing yet again, this time by Sir Arthur Sutherland, a Newcastle shipbuilder whose son Gordon eventually took over as managing director. Bertelli departed in 1936. Worn down by the endless cycle of brilliance on the track and penury in the accounts. What he left behind, however, was Claude Hill. And Claude Hill, working quietly through the late 1930s, produced something remarkable. The Atom prototype, completed in 1939, featured a tubular space frame chassis and independent front suspension. Technology that wouldn't become commonplace in sports car design for another 15 years. The Atom was, in engineering terms, a car from the future built in a workshop that could barely afford the present. It sat in the Feltham factory through the war years, waiting. Everything was waiting. Then, in late 1946, a small classified advertisement appeared in the Times, high-class motor business for sale. Asking price £30,000, replies to Box 51362. And the man who answered it would transform Aston Martin more completely than anyone before or since. Chapter 3. The man who answered the advertisement. David Brown was born in 1904 in Huddersfield, the grandson of the founder of David Brown & Sons, a company that had manufactured gears since 1860 and, more profitably, tractors. The family business was substantial, well-run and solidly Yorkshire. Brown had started as an apprentice at 17, cycling 6 miles to the factory by 7:30 every morning, learning the business from the shop floor upward. By the time that Times advertisement caught his eye, he was managing director of the entire operation. But Brown was not merely an industrialist who happened to like cars. He was a pilot who maintained his own airfield, a polo player, a racehorse breeder. A man who had built his own modified Vauxhall racer capable of 140 miles per hour, which, for a tractor manufacturer from the West Riding, suggested appetites somewhat larger than the family firm could satisfy. His management philosophy was characteristically direct and characteristically Yorkshire. Get a good man and let him get on with it. If he is no good, get another man. But if he is good, support him. It was, as philosophies go, spectacularly effective when applied to talented people, and catastrophically expensive when applied to a car company that had never once turned a profit. Brown visited the Feltham Works, test drove Claude Hill's Atom prototype, and was captivated. The chassis was brilliant. The handling was revelatory. The 2.0-litre four-cylinder engine, however, lacked punch. Brown wanted more power. And within months of purchasing Aston Martin in February 1947 for £20,500, considerably less than the asking price, because Brown was Yorkshire through and through, he learned that another company was also in financial difficulty. Lagonda had been building luxury cars since 1906. Their factory contained something that David Brown wanted very badly, a superb twin-cam straight-six engine designed by W.O. Bentley himself. The same W.O. Bentley who had founded the Bentley Mark, lost it to Rolls-Royce, and spent the following decade in what amounted to gilded professional exile, designing engines for a company that bore someone else's name. Brown visited the Lagonda works, met Bentley, examined the engine, and acquired Lagonda's assets for £52,500. It was a masterstroke. Martin's name, Hill's chassis, Bentley's engine, Brown's money. The marriage of these four elements, mediated by a tractor manufacturer's checkbook and a tractor manufacturer's appetite for risk, created Aston Martin Lagonda Limited. And with it, the DB prefix was born. Two letters that would become, over the next 7 decades, among the most coveted initials in the automotive world. Brown's first significant decision was to build cars that justified racing. His second was to hire people who could make them. And here, the story of Aston Martin shifts from the saga of romantic amateurs and aristocratic backers into something more remarkable, the assembly of a team whose collective genius had no business existing in a small factory in a Buckinghamshire market town. The first recruit arrived by accident. Tadek Marek, born in Krakow in 1908, had fled Poland during the war, served as a major working on Centurion tank engines for the British Army, and later designed engines at Austin. In 1953, he applied to Aston Martin. He received a rejection letter. A lesser man might have shrugged and moved on. Marek drove to Huddersfield, walked into David Brown's offices, and confronted the man himself. The rejection, it turned out, was a clerical error. Marek was hired on the spot. He would go on to design the all-aluminium twin-cam straight-six that powered every DB from the DB4 to the DB6, and the magnificent V8 engine that would power Aston Martins for more than 30 years. A career of that magnitude, launched by a bureaucratic mistake and a Pole's refusal to accept no for an answer. Harold Beach arrived in 1950 for £11 a week. During the war, when he'd worked on the floating tanks used in the D-Day landings, the amphibious Shermans that crawled up the Normandy beaches on the 6th of June, 1944. That experience with lightweight structures and unconventional engineering translated directly to what he would build at Aston Martin, the revolutionary platform chassis for the DB4, developed in collaboration with Carrozzeria Touring of Milan. Touring's patented Superleggera construction. Aluminium panels skinned over a skeletal frame of small diameter steel tubes, super light in every sense, gave Beach the method. His own genius gave it the signature details. The distinctive vents on the DB4's front wings designed to expel under-bonnet heat became an enduring Aston Martin hallmark. A functional solution so elegant it became a design icon. John Wyer, widely regarded as the greatest racing team principal of his generation, ran both the factory and the competition department with a discipline that bordered on the military. And Ted Cutting, who designed virtually every component of the Le Mans winning DBR1, completed a team that no manufacturer of Aston Martin's size had any right to possess. a Polish refugee who talked his way past a rejection letter, a D-Day engineer hired for 11 quid a week, a team principal of unmatched tactical brilliance, a designer whose work would win the most important endurance race in the world. Brown had found his men. Now he needed a home for them. Chapter 4. The Works at Tickford Street. In 1955, David Brown purchased the Tickford Coach Building Works on Tickford Street in Newport Pagnell, a market town in North Buckinghamshire that most Britons couldn't have found on a map. The site's history, however, stretched back nearly 2 centuries. Salmons and Sons had been building coaches, dog carts, hearses and bread wagons on that ground since the 1820s. By the 1930s, 450 people worked there, producing 30 bespoke car bodies per week in wood and metal. The skills were ancient, continuous, and exactly what Brown needed. Craftsmen who had shaped ash frames and beaten metal panels for horse-drawn carriages would now shape aluminium over the frames of the fastest sports cars in Britain. Brown chose Newport Pagnell precisely because of this unbroken tradition of handcraft. You couldn't train a panel beater overnight. You couldn't teach a man to work an English wheel from a textbook. These were skills passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, over generations. Hands that understood the behaviour of metal at an instinctive level that no engineering degree could replicate. When Brown moved Aston Martin's production to Tickford Street, he wasn't just relocating a factory, he was grafting a 20th century racing car mark onto the rootstock of 19th century coach building. The combination should have been absurd. Instead, it was the foundation of everything that followed. The factory itself was never grand. Peter Sprague, who would later own the company, described the headquarters building Sunnyside as a dilapidated small faux Tudor house of modest pretensions. The works were a hodgepodge of brick additions sprawled inelegantly around Sunnyside, the kind of place that grew by necessity rather than design, each new building added when the last one ran out of space. The operation straddled both sides of Tickford Street. Main production on the north side, the trim shop housed in a former cinema on the south. Total manufacturing space amounted to roughly 110,000 square feet on 14 acres. It would serve as Aston Martin's global headquarters for half a century. And it was here, in this unlikely collection of buildings in a Buckinghamshire market town, that the hand-building process reached its zenith. And each car took approximately 12 weeks and hundreds of man-hours to complete. Body panels were hand-beaten from sheets of Burma-bright aluminium alloy on wooden bucks, the shaped forms over which the metal was gradually coaxed into its final curves using English wheels, hammers, flatters, chasers, flippers, tuckers and dollies. The noise of the panel shop was so ferocious that Aston Martin provided earplugs to visitors. The men who worked there communicated through gesture and lip reading, their world defined by the rhythmic percussion of metal being persuaded into shape. After the panel shop, the paint process consumed 150 hours per car. 12 separate coats, with hand finishing between each layer, built up to a paint thickness of 180 microns, double that of a Porsche or a Mercedes. The depth of colour on a Newport Pagnell Aston Martin wasn't a visual trick or a marketing claim. It was the physical result of 12 layers of paint applied by hand, each one rubbed down, inspected and corrected before the next was laid. You could see it in the way the light moved across the bonnet. The surface had a liquid quality that machine-applied paint simply couldn't achieve. Across Tickford Street, in the former cinema, the trim shop worked through 11 Connolly hides per car, 10 for the interior, 1 stored for future repairs. The stitching was done by hand, the leather cut and shaped by craftsmen whose standards were measured not in millimetres, but in feel. A seat had to be right. Not right to specification. Right to the hand that ran across it. But the most remarkable aspect of Newport Pagnell was the engine room. Each engine, first the straight 6, later Marrick's magnificent V8, was hand-built by a single engine builder who spent more than a week selecting, balancing and assembling every component. There was no manual. Each builder had his own methods, his own preferences, his own understanding of how the pieces fitted together. From the mid-1970s, every engine carried a brass plate bearing the name of the man who had built it. Not the company, not the department, the man. Your Aston Martin's engine was built by someone with a name, and that name was fixed to the block for as long as the engine survived. At peak, Newport Pagnell produced roughly 10 cars per week. Over 52 years of continuous production, just 13,300 cars left the factory, fewer than a single Toyota plant produces in a week. In each one, a handmade object, each one carrying the fingerprints, the judgment, and the individual craftsmanship of men whose skills connected directly back to the coach builders who had worked that same ground since the reign of George IV. David Brown had his team, he had his factory, he had Marrick's engines, Beech's chassis, Cutting's racing designs, and Wyer's tactical genius. The machines were in place, the skills assembled, the tiny workforce trained. What happened next? The combination of motorsport triumph and cinematic accident that would transform Aston Martin from a respected but obscure manufacturer into the most glamorous car brand on earth belongs to the Golden Age. But it's worth understanding one thing before we arrive there. Everything that made Aston Martin extraordinary, the hand-building, the individual craftsmen, the 12-week production cycle, the brass nameplates, the cinema converted into a trim shop, was also everything that made it financially unsustainable. The beauty and the bankruptcy were not separate stories. They were the same story, told from different angles. 10 cars a week, 12 weeks per car, 13,000 over half a century. The numbers that made Newport Pagnell magnificent were the same numbers that would, eventually, nearly destroy it. The Golden Age was about to begin, and it was built, from the first bolt to the last coat of paint, on borrowed time. Chapter 5. A Working Day on Tickford Street. Imagine arriving for the morning shift at Newport Pagnell in 1963. You'd walk up Tickford Street from the town, past the terraced houses and the shops, and the first thing you'd notice, before you reached the gates, but before you clocked in, was the sound. Not one sound. A layered thing. The steady percussion of the panel shop carried furthest, a rhythmic metallic heartbeat that residents of Tickford Street had been hearing in one form or another, since Salmons and Sons were beating out coach panels in the previous century. Underneath it, if the wind was right, came the higher whine of machining from the engine shop and the intermittent bark of an engine being tested on the dynamometer. Newport Pagnell was a quiet market town. The works gave it a pulse. Through the gates, the smell hit you. Machine oil, first, that universal industrial baseline, slightly sweet, slightly acrid. Then leather, drifting across from the trim shop in the converted cinema on the south side of the street. And underneath both, the sharp, a clean tang of aluminium being worked, a metallic scent that got into your clothes and stayed there, so that your wife would know where you'd been even if you hadn't told her. The men who worked in the panel shop carried that smell like a signature. Decades later, retired panel beaters would catch a whiff of worked aluminium in some unrelated context and find themselves standing, mentally, back inside those brick walls. The works floor at its peak employed roughly 350 people producing 10 cars a week. That ratio, 35 workers per car, tells you everything about what Newport Pagnell was. This was not a production line in any conventional sense. There was no conveyor belt, no timed station rotation, no industrial engineer with a stopwatch calculating seconds per operation. Each car sat on trestles while the work came to it. The men moved between cars as their particular skills were needed, carrying their own tools, applying their own judgment. A panel beater named Jack Hilliam kept his tools in a canvas roll that he'd made himself. Every hammer, every dolly, every flatter had been shaped and weighted to his hand over years of use. They were, in the most literal sense, extensions of his body. When the factory closed in 1974, Hilliam rescued those tools as night watchmen turned a blind eye. He understood, in the way that only a craftsman can, that the tools were worth more than whatever the receiver might get for them at auction. The workflow began with the chassis. Harold Beech's platform design assembled from steel sections that were jigged, welded, and checked with a precision that owed more to aircraft construction than to traditional car building. Beech's wartime work on amphibious tanks had given him an instinct for lightweight rigidity that the chassis expressed in every joint. From there, the body took shape. The Superleggera framework went on first. Dozens of small-diameter steel tubes, each one hand-bent and fitted to create the skeletal form over which the aluminium skin would be draped. It looked, at this stage, like something between a birdcage and a sculpture, all structure, no surface, beautiful in its own austere way. Then the panel beaters went to work. They started with flat sheets of Burma-bright, and using the wooden bucks as guides, gradually persuaded the metal into the compound curves that gave a DB its shape. As the English wheel, a hand-operated tool consisting of 2 rollers between which the metal was passed and repassed, did the primary shaping. The skill lay not in the tool, but in the hands operating it. Too much pressure and the metal stretched beyond recovery. Too little and the curve wouldn't form. Each pass had to be judged by feel, by the sound of the metal moving through the rollers, by the subtle change in resistance that told an experienced man when the shape was right. A good panel beater could feel a deviation of 0.5 millimetre through his fingertips. An excellent one could feel less. The bonnet of a DB5, that long, graceful sweep from the grille to the windscreen, was formed from a single sheet. No joins, no welds, no seams to be hidden. One piece of aluminium, worked by hand over the course of several days, as until it matched the buck precisely. If it didn't match, if there was a ripple, a flat spot, a curve that wasn't quite true, the panel went back to the wheel. There was no acceptable deviation. The standard was perfection, and perfection was judged not by measurement, but by eye and hand. After the panels were shaped and fitted to the Superleggera frame, the car moved to the paint shop. The men who worked there operated in conditions of almost surgical cleanliness. Any dust particle trapped under the first coat would telegraph through every subsequent layer, creating a flaw visible in the finished surface. The process took days. Between each of the 12 coats, the surface was flatted by hand with progressively finer abrasives, inspected under raking light for imperfections, and corrected before the next layer was applied. The final coat was polished to a depth that photographs from the period can only approximate. In person, the paint on a freshly finished Newport Pagnell car had a 3-dimensional quality. You looked into the surface, not at it. In the trim shop across the street, the Connolly hides were laid out on broad tables and examined inch by inch for flaws. A single blemish, a scratch, a stretch mark, an insect bite scar meant that section of hide couldn't be used for a visible surface. The cutting was done by hand, the pieces shaped using patterns that had been refined over years until every seat, every door card, every dashboard covering fitted with the precision of a bespoke suit. The smell in the trim shop was extraordinary. Rich, warm, animal, new leather mixed with the adhesives and dyes that the trimmers used. And it underlaid with the faint mustiness of the old cinema building itself. It was the smell of luxury being assembled by hand, one stitch at a time. And through all of this, the beating, the painting, the stitching, the assembly, ran a current of conversation, argument and tea. The works canteen was where reputations were made and disputes settled. The panel beaters considered themselves the aristocracy of the shop floor. And they weren't entirely wrong. Their skills were the hardest to learn, the longest to master, and the most visibly connected to the finished product. The engine builders, who worked in quieter isolation, had their own hierarchy and their own pride. The trimmers, the painters, the electricians, the chassis men. Each group had its territory, its expertise, its sense of where it stood in the order of things. It was, in miniature, a complete industrial society compressed into 110,000 square feet on both sides of a Buckinghamshire high street. Chapter 6. The Coach Builder's Town. Newport Pagnell had been making things with wheels since before Queen Victoria was born. That mattered. When Aston Martin arrived in 1955, the town didn't have to learn what a coach-building works meant. The rhythms were already there, the shift patterns, the family trades, the understanding that a man's skill with his hands was his fortune and his inheritance. Fathers brought sons into the works. Grandfathers had worked for Salmons. Some families had been shaping wood and metal on that same ground for 4 generations, the craft passing down like a language spoken nowhere else. The town was small enough that the works couldn't hide in it. If production was good, the pubs knew by Friday. If there was trouble, a cancelled order, a rumour of redundancy, the anxiety spread through Newport Pagnell like weather. The Cannon pub and the Bull saw the same faces after every shift. Men still carrying the smell of machine oil and aluminium on their clothes, settling into conversations that moved between the cricket scores and the state of the order book without any clear boundary between the two. Sport and work and town life were all the same fabric. Women worked at Newport Pagnell too, though the histories rarely dwell on it. The trim shop, in particular, employed women whose needlework skills translated directly to the stitching of Connolly leather. The precision required, consistent stitch length, even tension, curves that followed the contour of a seat without bunching or pulling, was exactly the kind of fine motor skill that many women brought from dressmaking, upholstery, or the domestic sewing that was still a routine part of British household life in the 1950s and 1960s. Their contribution was essential. Their names, for the most part, went unrecorded. For the men who worked the panel shop, the job carried a physical cost that nobody discussed much at the time. The noise was extreme. Years of hammering left many panel beaters with significant hearing loss, a condition that wouldn't be acknowledged as industrial injury until long after the damage was done. The vibration from the English wheel travelled up through the hands and arms and, over decades, into the joints. These were not complaints the men made. Craft carried its own code of stoicism. You did the work, you went home, you came back. The price you paid for the skill was considered part of the skill itself. But the pride was real and deep. An Aston Martin panel beater could walk past a DB5 on a London street and identify his own work, not by any mark or signature, but by the particular quality of a curve, the way a wing line resolved into the door shut, the subtle differences that only the man who'd formed the metal could detect. It was authorship without attribution, craftsmanship so personal that the craftsman could read his own hand in the finished surface years after it left the works. When Newport Pagnell's men saw James Bond driving a DB5 on screen in 1964, they weren't watching a film. They were watching their own work, and elevated to a kind of immortality that no brass nameplate could match. The town's identity and the factory's identity had become, by the early 1960s, effectively inseparable. Newport Pagnell was Aston Martin. Aston Martin was Newport Pagnell. Letters addressed simply to Aston Martin Newport Pagnell arrived without difficulty. The road sign at the town's entrance read, and still reads, "Welcome to Newport Pagnell, home of Aston Martin Lagonda." For a market town of modest size in the orbit of what would later become Milton Keynes, that sign was a declaration of purpose. This was a town that made something beautiful, something that mattered. The community that the work sustained was not wealthy. These were skilled working men earning decent wages, and not the kind of money that the cars they built would eventually command at auction. The irony was always present, if rarely spoken aloud. The men who hand-built the most expensive sports cars in Britain could not afford to own one. But they could afford a house, a family, a life built on the security of craft. The works provided. As long as the orders came, as long as David Brown's chequebook held out, as long as the world wanted hand-built cars from a Buckinghamshire market town, Newport Pagnell would endure. Those were large assumptions. Every one of them would be tested. Chapter 7. The Hare, the Texan, and the most famous car in the world. David Brown's consuming obsession was Le Mans. The 24-hour race in northern France was, in the late 1950s, the supreme test of automotive endurance, and Aston Martin had come agonisingly close 3 times, finishing second in 3 consecutive years without quite managing to win. By 1959, Brown's patience was running thin. The investment was staggering for a company of Aston Martin's size. The team principal, Reg Parnell, understood that this might genuinely be the last chance. Parnell devised a strategy of brilliant ruthlessness. 3 cars would be entered. The number 4 car, driven by Sterling Moss and Jack Fairman, would be the Hare, driven at maximum attack from the start, its sole purpose to lure the Ferraris into an unsustainable pace. Moss, the fastest driver in the world, was the perfect instrument for this role. He would drive as though the race were a sprint, not an endurance event, and the Ferraris, unable to resist the challenge of a Moss on full song, would follow him into self-destruction. The number 5 car, Roy Salvadori and Carroll Shelby, had strict target lap times set 10 seconds per lap slower than Moss. Their job was to survive. The 3rd car, driven by Maurice Trintignant and Paul Frere, would run even more cautiously, an insurance policy in case the main plan failed. It worked with a precision that bordered on the cruel. Moss pulled the leading Ferraris into a pace they couldn't sustain over 24 hours. One by one, they broke. Moss's own car retired with engine failure, exactly as the strategy had anticipated. The Hare had done its work. The tortoise now had the road to itself. But survival required its own heroics. Salvadori drove for 14 extraordinary hours while recovering from flu. Exhaust heat, rerouted by a modification near the clutch pedal, burned his right foot so severely that he carried the scar for the rest of his life. He drove on. Carroll Shelby, the Texan co-driver, a former chicken farmer who had come to racing late and would later build the Cobra and revolutionize American motorsport, raced with a nitroglycerin tablet under his tongue. He had a heart condition. He hadn't told the team. He was already suffering from the illness that would force his retirement from racing within a year. At Le Mans in 1959, he drove through the French night with a failing heart and a chemical prop dissolving under his tongue, and he didn't mention it to anyone until the race was won. Aston Martin finished 1st and 2nd, and 2,701 miles covered at an average speed of 112 miles per hour. It was, and remains, the marque's only overall Le Mans victory. At the victory dinner in London, David Brown, who had climbed onto the winning car at the finish line in his bespoke suit, announced Aston Martin's withdrawal from works sports car racing. Ted Cutting, the designer of the winning DBR1, recalled Brown's tone at the dinner. David made it very clear that this was possibly our last shot at it. Not his last shot, you understand. Ours. The emphasis on ours carried the full weight of 25 years of subsidised ambition. Brown had got what he came for. The racing department's purpose was fulfilled. The victory secured the 1959 World Sports Car Championship. It placed Aston Martin alongside Ferrari, Jaguar, and Mercedes-Benz in the pantheon of Le Mans winners. And it created a halo of sporting credibility that would prove, 4 years later, to be worth more than any amount of advertising when a Scottish actor in a dinner jacket climbed behind the wheel of a silver-grey DB5. The DB5 itself was, mechanically, a refined evolution of the DB4. Marrick's Straight 6, enlarged to 3,995 cubic centimetres, produced 282 brake horsepower through a new ZF 5-speed gearbox. The price new was £4,248, roughly the cost of a house. Just 1,023 were built, 899 coupes, 123 convertibles, and a handful of Harold Radford shooting brakes commissioned by David Brown for his country pursuits. In Ian Fleming's novel Goldfinger, published in 1959, Bond drove a DB Mark III. By the time producers Albert Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman began filming the third Bond picture in 1963, the Mark III was obsolete. After considerable negotiation, Aston Martin was initially reluctant to lend cars for what seemed like a modest spy thriller. 2 DB5s were provided to the production. Special effects supervisor John Steers and production designer Ken Adam transformed the prototype, chassis number DP/216/1, into the most famous car in cinema history. Machine guns behind the indicator lights, an ejector seat, revolving number plates, oil slicks, tyre slashers, a bulletproof rear screen. Every modification was built to work on camera. The ejector seat genuinely fired. The number plates genuinely revolved. The result was the most successful product placement in the history of cinema. And it hadn't even been intended as product placement. Corgi's die-cast DB5 model became the best-selling toy of 1964. The car was exhibited at the New York World's Fair under the banner, "The most famous car in the world." And the association between Aston Martin and James Bond, born from a 12-year-old Ian Fleming watching Count Swarovski's Chitty Bang Bangs at Brooklands in 1924, carried through a novel in 1959 and cemented on screen in 1964, became the single most powerful brand connection in automotive history. The DB5 has since appeared in 8 Bond films across 6 decades. No other commercial object has sustained that kind of cultural presence for that long. Queen Elizabeth visited the Newport Pagnell factory. Prince Charles received a Seychelles blue DB6 Volante as a 21st birthday present from his mother, a car he still drives today, more than 55 years later, now converted to run on surplus English white wine and whey from the Duchy of Cornwall's cheesemaking process. When his engineers at Aston Martin Works initially resisted the bioethanol conversion, Charles told them plainly, "Well, I won't drive it then." They got on with it. The car now runs better on wine and cheese byproducts than it ever did on petrol. By the mid-1960s, Aston Martin had achieved something that no marketing strategy could have engineered, and no amount of money could have bought. It was simultaneously the car of James Bond, the car of the royal family, the car of Le Mans champions, and the car that Beatles and film stars queued to own. It was the most desirable automotive brand in the world, and it had never made a profit. Not once. Not in a single year since Bamford and Martin Limited was incorporated on the 15th of January, 1913. Chapter 8. The Price of Everything Beautiful. Here is the central paradox of Aston Martin in the mid-1960s, and it is worth understanding precisely because everything that follows depends on it. David Brown was personally subsidising the company's losses. Every DB5 that left Newport Pagnell, 12 weeks of skilled labour, 12 coats of paint, 11 Connolly hides, 1 hand-built engine with a brass nameplate, sold for a price that barely covered the cost of materials and labour. At 10 cars per week, economies of scale were a mathematical impossibility, and the factory existed in a space below the threshold where volume could offset cost. Every car was, in strict accounting terms, a small disaster. The disaster was just beautiful enough that people kept buying it. Brown funded the gap from his profitable businesses, the tractor division and the gear manufacturing operation at David Brown & Sons in Huddersfield. Aston Martin's losses were offset against the profits of tractors and industrial gearboxes. It was, in its way, a rather elegant arrangement. Yorkshire Engineering subsidising Buckinghamshire craftsmanship, the functional paying for the beautiful. Brown didn't mind. He'd bought Aston Martin because he loved cars, and the offset arrangement meant the losses were tax efficient. He once quipped, "As when a customer asked to buy a car at factory cost, certainly, that will be £2,000 over retail." It was a joke. It was also the truth. Meanwhile, the competition was industrialising. Porsche was scaling the 911 for volume production. Jaguar had built the E-Type, a car that could match Aston Martin for beauty and outperform it in many respects, at vastly greater volumes and significantly lower prices. Ferrari, under growing commercial pressure, was expanding production and would eventually sell a controlling stake to Fiat. The entire landscape of high-performance car manufacturing was moving towards greater volume, lower unit costs, and industrial efficiency. Newport Pagnell, with its hand-beaten panels and its 12-week build cycle, was moving in no direction at all. It was standing still, making beautiful things in the way it had always made them, while the world around it evolved. The DBS, styled by William Townes and launched in 1967, was designed around Tadek Marek's new V8 engine. But the V8 wasn't ready. 6 years of development costs had drained resources while producing nothing that could be sold. The DBS launched with the old straight six as a stopgap, a powerful, handsome car that was nonetheless compromised by the absence of the engine it had been designed to carry. When the V8 finally arrived in 1969, The company was simultaneously hemorrhaging money on a hopeless Formula One program. The DBR4 and DBR5 single-seaters consumed resources that the company didn't have, in pursuit of results that never came. And then the tax law changed. The precise mechanism matters less than the consequence. David Brown could no longer offset Aston Martin's losses against his profitable businesses. The financial architecture that had sustained 25 years of handmade cars, the arrangement where tractors quietly paid for the DB5 and the DB6 and the racing program and the V8 development and all of it, was dismantled by a revision to the tax code. The tractor division itself was under intense competitive pressure. The 1963 acquisition of Vosper & Company, a shipbuilding firm, had added complexity without adding profit. The David Brown Corporation was suddenly carrying weight it couldn't bear. By 1972, the board of the David Brown Corporation forced its founder to sell. He had no choice. The man who had rescued Aston Martin for £20,500 in 1947, who had married Martin's chassis to Bentley's engine, who had assembled Marrick and Beech and Wire and Cutting, who had won Le Mans and created the DB series and sustained the whole enterprise from his own pocket for a quarter of a century, was compelled to let it go. The sale price was £101, not 101,000. 101. The nominal value of shares transferred to a property development company called Company Developments Limited. Brown accepted the title of honorary president and a seat on the board. The new owners immediately dropped the DB prefix from all models. The golden age was over. What followed would be worse than anyone at Newport Pagnell could have imagined. Chapter 9. The Man in the Yellow Windcheater. William Wilson was a chartered accountant from Birmingham who described himself as an ebullient entrepreneur. He chaired Company Developments Limited, the property firm that had acquired Aston Martin for £101. And he arrived at Newport Pagnell with the confidence of a man who believed that what a failing car company needed was not engineering investment or production reform, but entrepreneurial energy. He and his wife Rachel were two of only 10 survivors of the 1957 Aquila Airways flying boat crash off the Isle of Wight, a fact that might have given a different kind of man a certain gravity. Wilson brought out 2 new models within 3 months of taking ownership. It was a bold start. It was also the last good news the workforce would hear. The timing could hardly have been worse. In October 1973, was the Arab oil embargo sent fuel prices spiralling across the Western world. The cars Aston Martin built, large, heavy, V8-powered Grand Tourers consuming fuel at a rate that now seemed almost obscene, were precisely the vehicles that the crisis rendered unsellable. Demand collapsed overnight. And California, the most important export market for British luxury cars, introduced new emissions standards that Aston Martin's engines couldn't meet. The company was simultaneously losing its domestic customers to the oil crisis and its American customers to regulation. The order book thinned, then it emptied. Inside the factory, the mood curdled. Workers who had spent their careers building cars under David Brown's paternalistic management now found themselves answering to an ownership structure that seemed disconnected from the reality of what they did. Wilson appointed Geoffrey Fletcher, a property expert, as managing director, a choice that told the workforce everything they needed to know about the new owner's priorities. Property men ran property companies. They didn't run car factories. The appointment landed on the shop floor like a verdict. As the company spiraled towards insolvency through 1974, Wilson's behaviour grew increasingly detached. Peter Sprague, who would later buy the company, recounted that Wilson showed up occasionally, wearing a yellow windcheater and orange socks. The image stayed with Sprague, and with the workforce, who passed it around with the dark humour of people watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. In the final weeks, while more than 400 workers faced redundancy and a bleak Christmas, Wilson spent a fortnight in Japan, enjoying the presidential suite at the Hotel Okura at £1,000 a day, complete with butler and limousine. The bill was sent to the Japanese importer. Photographs of Wilson enjoying Tokyo nightlife found their way to the factory floor a few days before the gates locked. The timing was, if nothing else, remarkable. The man responsible for the company's survival was being photographed in a Tokyo hotel suite, while the people who actually built the cars prepared for unemployment. Monday, the 30th of December, 1974. The workers of Newport Pagnell returned from Christmas to find the factory gates locked. There, an announcement directed them to the town cinema the following morning. The same building that housed the trim shop. The same cinema where Connolly hides had been stitched into the seats of DB5s. Marketing manager Fred Hartley introduced the receiver, Michael Clark. The company was pronounced bankrupt. Terms of redundancy were explained. More than 460 men and women walked out of that cinema and into the December cold without jobs. Many came from families who had crafted wheeled vehicles in Newport Pagnell for 4 generations, back to the Salmon's coach builders, back to the dog carts and the hearses, back to a tradition of handcraft that stretched to the 1820s. The chain was broken, not by foreign competition or technological change, but by an oil crisis, an accountant in a yellow wind cheater, and a company that had never, in 61 years of existence, found a way to make money. Jack Hilliam, the panel beater who had rescued his handmade tools as the night watchman looked the other way, found work at Rolls-Royce in Willesden. He later said, "We were all in a state of shock. I would finish our week's work by Wednesday. I couldn't work any slower." The pace of a Newport Pagnell craftsman, applied to mass production, simply didn't translate. The skills were too refined. The hands were too slow. The man was too good at his job for the job he now had. That evening, Walter Cronkite delivered a eulogy for Aston Martin on the CBS Evening News. He wore a black tie, something, it was reported, that he had never done for anyone. A British car company that most Americans had never heard of before James Bond received, in death, the tribute normally reserved for heads of state. The factory stood silent. The panel shop's percussion had stopped. The smell of aluminium and leather drifted from the empty buildings and dissipated into the Buckinghamshire air. Newport Pagnell was, for the first time in 150 years, a town that no longer made things with wheels. Chapter 10. The American Circus. Peter Sprague was 26 years old when he became chairman of National Semiconductor, making him arguably the first venture capitalist in what would later be called Silicon Valley. Yale-educated, wealthy, and possessed of the particular American confidence that treats impossible situations as puzzles to be solved rather than tragedies to be mourned. And Sprague owned a used 1960 DB4 that he loved with an intensity his business associates found difficult to understand. When news of the Newport Pagnell closure reached him in California, his wife Chiasa issued a challenge that would change the course of Aston Martin history. "Why don't you do something about it?" On the 6th of January, 1975, Sprague arrived at Newport Pagnell and was ambushed by 40 reporters who had somehow got wind of the visit. The Evening News ran a front-page banner headline, "Millionaire to the Rescue." Sprague, who hadn't actually committed to anything at that point, found himself cast in a role that British newspapers had already written for him. The rich American cavalry arriving to save a cherished British institution. The narrative was irresistible. It was also, at that moment, entirely fictional. There, walking through the dead factory for the first time, Sprague encountered what he later described as an eerie quiet with a background aroma of leather and oiled metal. The works that had shaken with the rhythm of hammer on aluminium for decades was now still. The receiver's office was unheated. It was January. Sprague sat in an uncomfortable wooden chair and began the conversation that would determine whether Aston Martin lived or died. He wasn't alone for long. George Minden, a Canadian hotelier who had just purchased 6 new V8 Aston Martins before the closure and found himself holding cars from a dead company, was conducting his own parallel rescue effort. Sprague spotted Minden's press conference in the International Herald Tribune, and the two joined forces. The resulting consortium was, by any conventional measure, an improbable collection of people to be running a British car factory. Receiver Michael Clark called the purchase offer inadequate and dismissed the consortium as the American Circus. The closing took place on a rainy Friday afternoon, not in a boardroom or a solicitor's office, but in a car park outside an office block in Solihull. They couldn't get indoors. At the final moment, with the paperwork spread across the bonnet of a car in the rain, Sprague's lawyer declared that the deal couldn't close because the cheque was drawn on the Bank of America rather than a British clearing bank. 20 minutes of argument in the drizzle followed before they sort of closed, in Sprague's own characteristically understated description. The purchase price was effectively £1,050,000, of which Sprague personally contributed £170,000 in cash. The Daily Mail ran a cartoon the following day, a small boy kneeling at his bedside in prayer. The caption read, "You needn't include Aston Martin tonight, dear. It's being saved." The factory reopened in September 1975 with 100 workers, less than a quarter of the pre-closure workforce. Production manager David Flint began the process of rebuilding and immediately discovered inefficiencies that defied belief. One craftsman was welding a bracket onto the chassis frame, while 40 feet down the same production line, another craftsman was carefully removing the identical bracket. They had tea together every day. Neither had ever questioned the arrangement. In the first 6 months, there were 2,300 engineering change orders, most initiated by the workforce themselves. Men who had known for years that certain processes were redundant but had never been asked. British property developer Alan Curtis joined the consortium after his teenage son, an Aston Martin devotee, received a telephone call from Peter Sprague. Curtis had insisted he had no interest in cars and would not invest. After walking through the factory, he signed on and eventually held a 42% stake. Curtis proved to be the consortium's most resourceful operator. During a crippling strike at Lucas, Aston Martin's electrical supplier, he drove to the picket line in a new V8 convertible with the top down, introduced himself to the 100-odd strikers, explained that tiny Aston Martin needed parts desperately, and the strikers opened the gates and helped him fill the boot. It was the kind of gesture that only works once, and Curtis made it work perfectly. The company was alive. Barely. The patient had been resuscitated in a car park in the rain by a semiconductor tycoon, a Canadian hotelier, and a property developer's teenage son. But being alive and being healthy were entirely different conditions. The next 6 years would test that distinction to breaking point. Chapter 11. 30 cars and a royal warrant. Victor Gauntlett arrived at Aston Martin in 1981 like a man walking into a burning building because he found the architecture interesting. A former RAF pilot who had built Pace Petroleum into one of Britain's largest independent fuel distributors, supplying over 450 garages, Gauntlett met Alan Curtis at a Sterling Moss benefit day at Brands Hatch in 1980, and saw an opportunity where most people would have seen only ruin. By early 1981, Pace and Tim Hurley's CH Industrials had taken over as joint 50-50 owners. Gauntlett became executive chairman. The factory employed 360 people, producing 3.5 cars per week. Gauntlett described himself as half overgrown schoolboy, half hard-nosed businessman. He wore a gold-chained pocket watch and compared his role to running a high-class jewellery business or a famous art gallery. His most quoted line, when asked how to make a small fortune from Aston Martin, "Start with a big one." It was a joke that contained, like Brown's quip about factory cost pricing, the precise and uncomfortable truth. In 1982, and Aston Martin produced 30 cars, 30 for the entire year. The factory that had once turned out 10 a week now managed barely 1 every 12 days. A worldwide recession and the car's ruinous fuel consumption had decimated the customer base to a point where the company's survival genuinely depended on finding the next order. The heating in the factory that built the most glamorous cars in the world, couldn't reliably be kept on. Parts were sourced hand to mouth. In October 1984, 60 workers were made redundant, nearly a third of the remaining workforce. That same year, the company that had been valued at nothing when Brown sold it, and at £1 million when Sprague bought it, was valued at £2 million. The entire enterprise, the name, the factory, the tools, the workforce, the racing heritage, the Bond connection, everything, could have been purchased for less than the price of a modest London house. And yet, in 1982, Aston Martin received its royal warrant of appointment from the Prince of Wales. 30 cars a year and a royal warrant. The most extraordinary disparity between reputation and output in the history of British manufacturing. Gauntlet's survival strategies combined creativity with desperation in roughly equal measure. He sold the angular Lagonda, William Towne's extraordinary wedge-shaped four-door, featuring the world's first digital LCD instrument panel inspired by Peter Sprague's national semiconductor connections. Aggressively in Middle Eastern markets, where its strange mix of high-technology vulgarity and old-world charm found buyers who appreciated both qualities simultaneously. He created Tickford, an engineering subsidiary that sprinkled what he called Aston Martin gold dust on other companies' products. And he resurrected the Zagato collaboration, selling 52 Vantage Zagato coupes at £86,000 each, a critical financial lifeline that kept the factory open when nothing else could. The cars themselves occasionally transcended the chaos behind them. The V8 Vantage, launched in 1977 with 375 brake horsepower and a top speed of 170 miles per hour, 1/10 of a second faster to 60 than a Ferrari Daytona, was hailed as Britain's first supercar. Towne's Bulldog concept of 1979, with 600 brake horsepower and gull-wing doors, was designed to brake 200 miles per hour. Gauntlett cancelled it because the company couldn't afford the development costs. A Saudi prince bought the sole example. 43 years later, in 2023, the Bulldog finally achieved the speed it was built for. Some ambitions simply refused to die. Gauntlett personally negotiated the return of James Bond to Aston Martin for the Living Daylights in 1987. When Cubby Broccoli recast Bond with Timothy Dalton, Gauntlett supplied his own personal pre-production V8. Vantage for filming and sold a Volante to Broccoli directly. He was offered the role of a KGB colonel in the film, but declined. I would have loved to have done it, but really could not afford the time. The man running a car company that produced 30 vehicles a year didn't have time for a film cameo. The priorities were, at least, clear. Peter Livanos, heir to a Greek shipping dynasty, and invested through a joint venture and provided the financial stability that Gauntlet's energy alone could not. But Gauntlett knew, with the clarity that exhaustion eventually brings, that Aston Martin needed something bigger than a shipping heir's patience. It needed an industrial partner with the resources to transform a cottage industry into a viable business. In May 1987, during the revival of the Mille Miglia in Italy, Gauntlett found himself at dinner in the home of Contessa Maggie, seated beside a man who could provide exactly that. Chapter 12. The Car That Saved Everything. Walter Hayes was Ford's Vice President of Public Affairs and one of the most consequential figures in post-war motorsport, the visionary who had commissioned the GT40, the Lotus Cortina and the Cosworth DFV engine that dominated Formula One for a generation. And at dinner in Italy, Hayes listened to Gauntlet's familiar litany of financial desperation, and saw not a dying company but a dormant brand of extraordinary power. According to Hayes' son Richard, his father approached Henry Ford II with a simple pitch. Look, you've tried Ferrari and didn't get it. Why not Aston Martin? Another account has Hayes dropping in on Ford and being asked, well, Walter, what are we going to do today? Hayes replied, well, we could always buy Aston Martin. By September 1987, Ford had acquired a 75% stake for approximately £20 million. Aston Martin was building 5 cars per week. Hayes became executive chairman in 1991 after Gauntlett retired, and he understood the cultural minefield with a precision that many corporate acquirers lack entirely. That, his son recalled, he was nervous Ford would come in and smother Aston Martin, to apply that budget for building everything on the same platform and sort of crush the Aston Martin out of Aston Martin. The fear was well-founded. Ford's corporate instinct was to standardise, to share platforms, to extract efficiencies. Hayes' job was to take Ford's money while protecting the thing that made the money worth spending. The instrument of salvation was the DB7, and its genesis was a masterpiece of corporate improvisation. When Ford cancelled Jaguar's over-budget XJ41 project in 1989, Tom Walkinshaw proposed repurposing the Jaguar XJS platform for Aston Martin. Scottish designer Ian Callum, who at 14 had sent drawings to Jaguar hoping for a job, was tasked with creating the body. When Jaguar's management rejected his design, their Hayes seized it. Rather than presenting a clay model to the Ford board, Walkinshaw and Callum drove in a running car. The executives were stunned. The entire project cost approximately $30 million, staggeringly cheap by automotive standards. The DB prefix returned with David Brown's personal permission. Brown was made Honorary Life President. He died on the 3rd of September 1993, having transformed a £20,000 purchase into one of the world's most iconic automotive brands. He did not live to see the car that would vindicate everything he'd built. The DB7 launched at the 1993 Geneva Motor Show at £78,500. Production began not at Newport Pagnell, but at a new facility in Bloxham, as Oxfordshire, a pragmatic decision that acknowledged what everyone at Tickford Street already knew. The hand-building methods that made Newport Pagnell extraordinary also made it incapable of producing cars in the volumes that survival demanded. Over 7,000 DB7s were built, making it by far the best-selling Aston Martin in history. Before the DB7, annual production had been approximately 200 cars. By 1995, 700 left the factories. Ian Callum later reflected, "It was one of the very few cars that Aston Martin made money out of." Newport Pagnell continued building the V12 Vanquish, each one taking 8 working weeks, bonded aluminium and carbon fibre, married to the same hand-finishing tradition. James Bond drove a Vanquish in Another Day. But in September 2003, Aston Martin opened its first purpose-built factory at Gaydon in Warwickshire, a former RAF V bomber base capable of producing 7,500 cars per year. The DB9, the first car built there, used a new scalable platform that could support a range of models at volumes Newport Pagnell could never achieve. At 11:45 on the 19th of July 2007, a jet black Vanquish S Ultimate Edition, chassis number 502593, was driven off the Newport Pagnell production line by Kenny Clark, who had given 43 years of service to the company. Around 200 people watched. Kingsley Riding Fels, Director of Work Service, spoke for all of them. "A little part of each of us will live on in the cars, and Aston Martin never dies." It was the 2,578th Vanquish. One of the over 13,300 cars hand-built on Tickford Street since 1955. Most of the north side buildings were subsequently demolished. Plans for a Tesco supermarket on the site were drawn up but never realised. The south side became Aston Martin Works, a heritage restoration and service facility employing roughly 100 people using many of the same tools. The production line had gone. The tradition somehow remained. Chapter 13. The Pattern That Won't Break. In 2007, the same year the last car left Newport Pagnell, Ford sold Aston Martin. The American company had lost $12.7 billion the previous year and was offloading assets to survive. A consortium led by David Richards, the ProDrive chairman who had been Ari Vatanen's co-driver when they won the 1981 World Rally Championship, purchased the company with Kuwaiti investors for £479 million. Ford had transformed a 5-car-per-week boutique into a 7,000-car-per-year business. The price reflected that transformation. The financial crisis of 2008 reflected the fragility underneath it. Investment Dar, the Kuwaiti backer, was devastated by the crash. The old pattern reasserted itself: new ownership, fresh capital, then crisis. Italian private equity firm Invest Industrial took a 37.5% stake for £150 million in 2012. At the October 2018 IPO, the first British carmaker to list on the London Stock Exchange in 4 decades, Aston Martin was valued at £4.33 billion. The share price was £19. By May 2020, the shares hit 27.5 pence, a 98.5% collapse. A £10,000 investment at IPO was worth roughly £158. The most glamorous name in British motoring had become, in the language of the city, a value trap. A brand so powerful that investors kept believing in it, and a business so fundamentally challenged that it kept destroying their money. Lawrence Stroll, the Canadian billionaire whose early investments in Tommy Hilfiger and Michael Kors had built a fashion fortune of over $3.9 billion, and invested £182 million for a 16.7% stake in January 2020. Without it, the board acknowledged, the company could not continue operating. Stroll became executive chairman. He connected Aston Martin to his Formula One team, previously Force India, purchased from its own bankruptcy, and hired legendary designer Adrian Newey for the 2026 regulations reset. Total Stroll investment since 2020, approximately £600 million. Revenue in 2025 fell 20% to $1.26 billion. The pre-tax loss widened to $363.9 million. Net debt reached $1.38 billion. In February 2026, Aston Martin announced a 20% workforce reduction, 600 of 3,000 jobs, citing American tariffs and weak Chinese demand. The company has never made a sustained net profit since going public. 4 chief executives have served in 4 years. Consider what died while Aston Martin lived. Jensen closed in 1976. Triumph, killed by British Leyland's mismanagement. Austin Healey, same fate. MG Rover, collapsed in 2005. TVR, lurching through crises for decades, revival cars still undelivered. Bristol Cars, liquidated in 2020. Sunbeam, gone. Every one of them possessed loyal customers, engineering talent, and a brand with emotional resonance. Every one of them is dead or functionally dead. Aston Martin survived because it never merged into British Leyland. Because a 12-year-old boy watched a count race at Brooklands in 1924 and grew up to write spy novels. Well, because that accident of childhood memory created a cultural connection so powerful that it transcended every rational measure of commercial viability. Because a succession of wealthy romantics, a Polish count, a Yorkshire tractor maker, an American semiconductor pioneer, a Canadian hotelier, a Greek shipping heir, a former RAF pilot, Ford Motor Company, a rally champion, and a Canadian fashion billionaire kept falling in love with what Newport Pagnell represented and kept writing cheques to keep it alive. The town still bears the road sign. Welcome to Newport Pagnell, home of Aston Martin Lagonda. Letters addressed simply to Aston Martin Newport Pagnell still arrive at the right place. In October 2025, 150 classic Aston Martins returned to Tickford Street for the 70th anniversary celebration. As owners from across Europe drove cars that had been built by men whose fathers had built coaches on the same ground. The same English wheels. The same wooden bucks. The same tools. Historian Steve Waddingham noted that Aston Martin owners worldwide know Newport Pagnell the way people know Buckingham Palace, a place defined entirely by what was made there. Aston Martin Works employs roughly 100 people in heritage restoration, using many of the original tools. In 2017, production returned to Tickford Street with the DB4 GT continuation programme, followed by the DB5 Goldfinger continuation. 25 cars at £2.75 million each, built with working replica gadgets on the same site where the original was hand-beaten from aluminium sheets in 1963. The craftsmen restoring and recreating these cars are, in some cases, the sons of the men who built the originals. The coach-building skills on this site are continuous since the 1820s. 200 years of making beautiful things by hand in a small English market town. King Charles still drives the Seychelles Blue DB6 Volante. 55 years old, running on English wine and cheese whey, maintained by the same works that built it. When his cousin Lord Snowdon heard about the bioethanol conversion, he offered a single observation. How does Prince Charles drive his Aston Martin? Carefully. The most striking image isn't the gleaming DB5 on a cinema screen or the Vanquish crossing the Le Mans finish line. It's the workshop at Newport Pagnell today. The same room where body panels were hand-beaten in 1964. The same tools. The same wooden bucks. But now the craftsmen are restoring the very cars they, or their fathers, built 60 years ago. The circle closes in a room that smells of aluminium and leather and machine oil, just as it has smelled for longer than anyone alive can remember. Aston Martin has survived 7 bankruptcies, 12 ownership changes, 2 world wars, the death of virtually every rival. It has been rescued by a cyclist, a count, an engineer from Cardiff, a tractor maker, a semiconductor pioneer, a hotelier, an oil man, a shipping heir, Ford, a rally champion, and a fashion billionaire. It has never managed sustained profitability. Not through one failure. Not through catastrophe. Through the same beautiful, stubborn, financially ruinous insistence on making things by hand that nearly killed it a dozen times, and that remains. After 113 years, the only reason anyone cares that it's still here.